Afternoon, or good evening, or good morning whenever you're watching this. My name is Gene Rice. I am an associate professor of philosophy at Fort Hays State University. And this mini lecture is called Topics in Ethics: Moral Disagreement, Relativism, and Tolerance. It's likely that you have already seen an introduction to ethics and done a little bit of reading on what ethics is. Nonetheless, we'll spend a minute here doing a bit of a review just to remind you and to set the stage for our talk here today. So, ethics is, as we had defined it before, the study of human conduct. And when we're talking about philosophical ethics, we're talking importantly about normative or evaluative questions in ethics, in what people choose to do or not to do. So this was the distinction between describing, explaining ethical beliefs and justifying them. And of course, in this class, you're going to be doing the latter, that is, engaging in evaluating and arguing about what people should or ought to do or to refrain from doing. So, it is with this understanding of our general task that we investigate some important issues in ethics having to do with cultural relativism. The first thing we want to point out is a definition of skepticism. A skeptic is someone who is doubtful, who has doubts. In particular, they may doubt that there is knowledge or that we could prove that we have knowledge about some particular matter. We might make a distinction, or hopefully it would be helpful to make a distinction between global skeptics and local skeptics. A global skeptic is someone who doubts that any knowledge at all of anything or proof of anything is possible. That's a very broad and, in some cases, counterintuitive notion, which we won't spend any time on today. What we're going to be interested in is a form of local skepticism. A local skeptic believes not everything is questionable or doubtful, but that certain areas of inquiry or certain practices are doubtful or doubtful to lead to any kind of truth. So we could be skeptic, for example, about a theory in modern psychology, or we could be, hopefully we are, a little skeptical about astrological claims, right? That we can read your future by looking at the stars. Anyway, so one form of local skepticism is skepticism about moral truth, and that will be our focus for today. A form, well, there are lots of forms of moral skepticism, and skepticism in ethics has been around for a long, long time, almost as long as we have writings that are ethical and philosophical in nature. And so we're going to look at really three related areas. The first has to do with the issue of moral disagreement. And the second has to do with the issue of what we'll call cultural relativism, or one form of cultural relativism. And lastly, we'll look at exploring some of the relationships between relativism and what we'll call tolerance. So these are three issues which will probably come up fairly quickly, if they haven't already come up in your own mind or in the mind of your classmates, as you go through this semester in ethics. You won't imagine in my class, or if someone else is teaching this particular section, you won't spend a lot of time on these issues, but for some of you these questions will persist or will reoccur over the course of this semester. So it's important that we at least air them, and my goal today is really to steer you clear of some common misconceptions or some mistaken beliefs about the relationship between disagreement and tolerance and your study of ethics. So let's begin then with looking at the issue of moral disagreement. It's no surprise that people disagree about moral truths or about moral practice. And one reason, one important reason why a person might be a moral skeptic is that there is such a long-standing disagreement. And it doesn't take a genius to come up with a lot of examples of moral disagreement. We, in our own country, in the United States, we have quite a disagreement over abortion, an ongoing disagreement over capital punishment. Prior to that, of course, we had disagreements about slavery and about women's rights. We currently have ongoing disagreement about alcohol use, drug use, about sexuality, and about marriage practices and government sponsoring of marriage. All of these examples of moral disagreement might be taken to suggest or even to prove that there is no such thing as moral truth, or that we ought to be skeptical or doubtful that any particular claim, any particular moral belief is more true or more valid than any other belief. And so, because there is such disagreement on moral truths, this is a very common belief, and we want to investigate it and show at least one or two major problems with this view. So let's begin. The first thing I want to do is accept that moral disagreement exists. I think it's obvious that it exists. I think it would be folly to try and deny it. The extent of disagreement, I suppose, is something we could spend a lot of time debating. Do societies and cultures really have a lot of disagreement about fundamental issues, or is there really not so much disagreement in practice? Maybe these are a little misleading. But I'm going to set those issues aside and just accept that moral disagreement exists. And we'll initial this with the two letters MD, moral disagreement, so that we can refer to this idea, this belief more easily here today. So let's suppose that moral disagreement exists and that it's a fact and that you can't refute it. What does this mean, if anything, for the question of moral truth? In other words, is it the case that because disagreement exists, we must accept that there is no moral truth, either outside of our own beliefs or outside of our culture's beliefs? The answer to that question is no. It does not mean, the existence of moral disagreement does not mean that we must throw out all hope of finding objective moral truths. And let's take a look then at why this is the case. First of all, we should ask ourselves why we feel so strongly about moral disagreement. In fact, moral disagreement or disagreement in morality is not unique. In fact, every area of inquiry, every science, every historically important group of people who inquired into the truth encountered disagreement. In fact, long-standing disagreement, vehement or angry disagreement. There is no such thing as an area of inquiry which didn't have disagreement. Even if you think something like, how could we disagree that the earth is round? Well, if you looked hard enough, I'm sure you would find people who think the earth is flat. Here in western Kansas, you may find more of those people than other places in the world because it is so darn flat. But anyway, my point here is that there are long-standing disagreements in all areas of inquiry, and not just in moral thinking or moral philosophizing. So in physics, you have a long-standing debate about superstring theory, which I don't really know all that much about, but I do know that physicists differ vehemently on whether that theory of the ultimate foundation of reality is good or bad. In psychology, of course, every so often, one theory gets replaced by another, and there are lots of disagreements among psychologists over what counts as a disease, how we should treat mental illness, and so forth. The same is true, this fact of disagreement is true for all the sciences. Sociology, even mathematics, will have long-standing disagreement. What does this mean for ethics? Well, what it means is, if you're going to be consistent in throwing out moral truth because of moral disagreement, you will also have to throw out the hope for any truth whatsoever. All right? So, most people are loath to do that. That is, they do not want to do that. They see somehow some difference between moral disagreement and other kinds of disagreement. Now, you may want to take this question up in your class further, and it may be that after some amount of thinking, you can prove that there is some qualitative or quantitative difference between disagreement in morality as opposed to disagreement in some other area of inquiry. But that's harder than it may appear to you now, and my point here in this mini lecture is only to make sure that you're aware that it is much more difficult than it seems on the surface, and that if you want to throw out moral truth only on the grounds of moral disagreement, by way of consistency, you are either going to have to throw out all truth or come up with some way to distinguish the nature of the disagreement as being different. All right. So that's our first topic. Let's look at the second. The second topic is the topic of cultural relativism, which is obviously, as we'll see here in a second, related. There are different ways of defining cultural relativism. My own definition here is that cultural relativism claims that moral beliefs arise from one's culture and gain whatever validity or truth they might have from that culture. Some studies have suggested that students like yourself, that is, college students, tend to be cultural relativists. In my own experience, I don't think that's really true, but of course, my experience is somewhat limited. Nonetheless, it's an important objection to moral theorizing and to thinking about moral or ethical questions that should be considered relatively early on. Let's look then at some of the common arguments for cultural relativism. The first is existing moral disagreement. And we already talked about that and have, at least if not refuted it, given you reason to think that there's got to be something more to cultural relativism than that. If it's not merely moral disagreement, but the fact that the disagreement or the diversity seems tied to one's culture, then we have a slightly different argument for cultural relativism, and this is the argument which we'll call from cultural diversity. This is the belief that on some, or perhaps many, important moral issues, the differences or the disagreements we encounter are tied to one's culture. So perhaps in America we have a certain view of women's rights that is not shared in other countries, which would subordinate women. Or in America, people tend to view owning handgun as a moral right, whereas in other cultures it is not considered such a right. In some places you can smoke marijuana and drink alcohol, and in other countries you can do neither. Of course, in the United States you can do both, but only one is legal right now. Okay. So let's look then at what this argument might amount to. Remember, in philosophy, it's not what people think, but why they think it. And so let's flesh out the argument for cultural relativism and take a look at the possible premises. A premise is just the reasons for accepting a conclusion. And so in the slide, which you've already seen, the first premise says that accepted moral norms vary from culture to culture. Again, this is very much like the moral disagreement argument, only we've tied the disagreement to culture. The second premise is that morality just is following what our culture prescribes or tells us to do. This is usually a hidden or an unstated premise. That is something that people who believe the argument simply have accepted. This will give us then the conclusion, which I've abbreviated there again as cultural relativism, that moral norms vary from culture to culture. Although this looks like a fairly straightforward argument, there are problems with it. And let's look at two interpretations of this argument, both of which focus on slightly different elements of the argument. The first interpretation will looks at the second premise, which says that morality just is following what our culture prescribes. So let's investigate that a little bit more. Suppose we are in culture A, and our culture tells us that these three things are good. The first is family, The second is, I don't know, alcohol is okay. And the third is that red people are better than everybody else. If we were to accept cultural relativism, we would have to accept that family is good, that alcohol is good, and that red people are better than every other kind of people. Now, if this is true, if we accept the argument from cultural relativism, including that second premise, we are confronted immediately with a problem. And the problem has to do with moral reform. Excuse me, that's an F there. Moral reform. Thank you. How is it that we would ever change a moral belief which we think is wrong? Now, in this case, number 3 seems clearly to be wrong. Even though we may not be talking directly about Native American Indians, it's clear that the color of one's skin, whether it be red, black, white, or yellow, is not a determining factor in how good or worthy they are as individuals. But if we go the route of cultural relativism, it is impossible for us to reform any existing cultural belief. Suppose I come in, suppose I'm Martin Luther King, and I say, suppose culture A is 1900 America that says that white people are better than everybody else. And I'm Martin Luther King and I say, not 3. That is, this is immoral. White people are not better than black people or red people or yellow people. According to cultural relativism, I'm wrong. And there's no possible reason I could argue that would refute the belief that white people are better than other people. And that's because, according to cultural relativism, morality just is what the culture says. And so, to believe in cultural relativism is to deny, by definition, the possibility of moral reform. And that's a pretty serious objection, because no matter how much you may love your culture, it's unlikely that you would think that it is correct in every single moral belief that it promotes or holds. And so this is a problem, a major problem with this interpretation of cultural relativism. Suppose then that we take a different understanding of cultural relativism and we say, well, what cultural relativism means is that everybody should do what their culture says. So let's see, this will be culture A and this will be culture B, and culture A believes 1, 2, and 3, and culture B believes 2, 3, and 4. And what relativism means is that if you're in A, suppose your name is Jean, and you're in culture A, then you should believe 1, 2, and 3 in order to be moral. And if you're Amy or Lee or whoever, and you're in culture B, then you should believe what that culture believes, namely 2, 3, and 4. The problem with saying that to be good, everyone should follow their culture is that you have just given a non-relative moral principle. To be good, everyone should follow their culture is a universal moral principle. And if relativism has tried to argue for anything, it's that there aren't any universal moral principles. And so there's an obvious contradiction there in this form of relativism. So, on both interpretations, the first and here the second, we have very important objections to this kind of belief that morality is what the culture tells us it is. Now, there are other forms of relativism out there, and I don't mean to say that philosophers have totally rejected cultural relativism. But they have rejected these simple kinds of relativism, which focus on moral disagreement or on the fact that cultures tend to produce or promote different moral practices or beliefs or values in particular instances. So again, this is kind of a warning not to fall into that common trap. All right. So we've looked at moral disagreement and what it means or doesn't mean for moral truth. We've looked at then cultural relativism, what it means or doesn't mean for moral truth, for ethical investigation. And let's look at the last, and this is has to do with the issue of tolerance. As we have seen in the previous two instances, the issue of tolerance has some relationship to ethics and to skepticism, but not perhaps the relationship that we initially thought. Today, especially in America and in Western Europe, you hear a lot about tolerance. It's a virtue. It's basically the virtue to accept or put up with practices or beliefs or values which you may not agree with. If you're a parent, when your kids get older, you have to tolerate a little bit of behavior which you don't think is perhaps the best, right? Maybe the kid dresses funny or I don't know, runs her mouth too much or something. If you're a legislator, you may have to tolerate or pass certain bills which you don't really agree with 100% because you think that tolerance is a virtue and we all have to get along. The opposite of tolerance is to be ethnocentric, which believes that my culture is better than everybody else's. All right? In a modern liberal state, it's obvious that ethnocentrism would sabotage the system because we need people of different views to get along. And so tolerance is a virtue which you may hear quite a bit about. We want to respect other cultures. And that is a lot of what is involved with tolerance, is respecting other people's cultures. We do not want to be ethnocentric bullies who always think that our way is the best way. Americans are famous for going over to other countries and engaging in ethnocentric behavior, thinking that the American way is always the best way and disrespecting other people's culture. So it's important to be tolerant. But if we're tolerant, does that mean that we ought to be relativists? Remember, cultural relativism said that ethical truth, ethical value is relative to or tied to one's cultural beliefs. Here again, we have a variety of interpretations and problems with them. Suppose we say that tolerance is a virtue and that everyone should be tolerant. Now I'm writing this up on the board. It's also on your chart there, or on the PowerPoint slide. If we claim everyone should be tolerant, we have violated cultural relativism because we have made, again, a universal claim. Everyone should be tolerant. And that is not consistent with cultural relativism. And so if you want to be tolerant, you are not necessarily, or in fact you're probably not going to be led in the direction of cultural relativism, because you will be promoting a universal prescription. Now of course, what we're tolerant about is a very good question. Some things perhaps we should tolerate, and other things perhaps we should not tolerate. But those are other interesting questions which we don't have time to deal with today. Let's look at one last interpretation. Suppose we accept that, that tolerance is not a universal thing, and we say instead that, that tolerance, that if your culture is tolerant, then you should follow it. The problem with this interpretation, or this view, of course, is that not all cultures are tolerant. And in fact, there's probably some level of intolerance in every culture. And some cultures are wildly intolerant. We can think historically of Nazi Germany and plenty of other examples where we had very intolerant cultures. So if we say, well, what we mean by promoting tolerance is that we should follow our culture, and our culture is tolerant. We have to recognize that not all cultures are tolerant. And so those cultures will not be endorsing tolerance the way perhaps we had hoped at the beginning when we endorsed tolerance as a virtue. So again, these are complicated issues, and we're not going to solve them here in a 15 or 30-minute lecture. And I encourage you to talk with your professors about these issues, and with your fellow students and your families about these issues. They're important meta-ethical concerns, and there are concerns which they may stay with you the entire course, or you may not worry about them too much. But I did want to point out for you there at the beginning of the semester some of these common mistakes, and hopefully head you off from making one of these mistakes and getting you back on some more solid ground, and give you some other things to think about. So that ends this mini lecture, and good luck with your ethical quest.